The rhythmic click-clack of laptop keys was the only sound competing with the low hum of the refrigerator at 6:30 in the morning. Clara Higgins sat at the corner of the quartz kitchen island, her fingers moving with practiced precision across a corporate ledger. A lukewarm mug of generic coffee sat, forgotten, by her hand, wearing a faded two-season-old Target fleece, her hair pulled back into a hasty bun. Clara looked less like the co-owner of the house and more like a permanent piece of domestic machinery. The heavy tread of leather-soled shoes broke the quiet. Julian stepped into the kitchen, radiating the sharp scent of expensive sandalwood cologne. His tailored navy pinstripe suit cost more than Clara's monthly bookkeeping retainer. He didn't look at her. Instead, he checked his golf app and let out a dry, performative sigh. "Did you remember my white linen shirts at the eco-cleaners?" Julian asked, his voice directed entirely at the microwave reflection. "I did it yesterday, Julian," Clara replied softly, her voice carrying the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had spent years minimizing her own presence. "They'll be ready by 4. Julian didn't acknowledge her. He merely grunted, took a critical bite of an organic apple, and frowned. "You really need to do something about your posture, Clara. And that fleece makes you look like you've completely given up." Bill's wife asked me why you always look so distracted. "It's hard to build a premium network at the bank when my own wife looks like she's managing a garage sale." The words were dropped with the icy indifference of absolute contempt. This was Julian's preferred weapon, stonewalling wrapped in critique. He looked right through her, treating her labor, both the domestic chores and the freelance bookkeeping that quietly covered their rising utility bills, as entirely invisible. Grabbing his golf cap, he walked out toward the garage, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. Clara sat perfectly still, but the numbers blurred. Her mind drifted back to the bitter reality of how they had arrived in this affluent Chicago suburb. 3 years ago, when her father passed away, she had made the painful decision to sell the family's multi-generational corn farm in Kansas. It was a piece of her soul, but she had envisioned a fresh start for her own family. She had funneled exactly 80% of the down payment for this $650,000 suburban home directly from that inheritance. Julian had contributed a mere 20%, yet when it came time to sign the closing paperwork, he had unleashed a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "If we put your name on the primary mortgage deed, the underwriters will flag your unstable freelance income," Julian had argued smoothly, leaning over the table with manufactured sincerity. "It'll spike our interest rate. Don't you trust me, Clara? We're a team. My position as a mortgage loan officer means I can lock in a premier employee rate if it's solely under my name. If you insist on dual ownership right now, it proves you don't believe in our future. You're letting your past dictate our children's security." Exhausted, pregnant, and desperate to maintain domestic harmony, Clara had relented. She had signed the papers, allowing Julian to stand as the sole legal owner. It was a miscalculation she would regret with every fiber of her being. The true depth of her invisibility materialized 3 weeks later on a bitterly cold November afternoon. Clara returned from the grocery store, her dinged-up 2012 Honda Civic rattling into the driveway. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw a commercial moving truck idling on the cul-de-sac. Walking through the front door, she was met by her mother-in-law, Evelyn Higgins, who was directing 2 burly movers. But it wasn't Evelyn's belongings that made the blood freeze in Clara's veins. It was what was missing. In the sunlit corner of the living room, her late mother's vintage Singer sewing machine was gone. It was the last remaining heirloom from her childhood. "Evelyn," Clara's voice trembled. "Where's my mother's sewing machine?" Evelyn turned, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "Oh, Clara, darling. Julian didn't text you? My condo had a plumbing failure. so I'm moving into the guest suite. That old, clunky iron contraption completely ruined the architectural aesthetic. This is a premium suburban estate, not a rustic barn in the Corn Belt. I had the movers take it out to the industrial dumpster at the end of the alley. It's where it belongs. Clara looked past her to the driveway. Julian was leaning against his new BMW, scrolling through his phone. Catching her eye through the glass, he simply muttered, "Mom knows interior design, Clara. Let her handle it." They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to cry, to validate their narrative that she was unstable. But as the freezing Illinois sleet began to fall outside, the heavy, submissive fog that had clouded Clara's brain for years vanished, replaced by a crystalline calm. Late that night, while the house slept, Clara walked out into the freezing darkness. She made her way to the industrial dumpster and found the heavy iron sewing machine abandoned amidst trash bags. Her hands shook from the biting wind as she pulled a heavy waterproof tarp over the machine, securing it tightly against the elements. She rested her forehead against the cold iron. She did not shed a single tear. Tears were a waste of hydration when you were preparing for an audit. She realized that by treating her as a shadow, they had granted her the ultimate advantage: invisibility. The victim had died in the sleet. The forensic accountant had just awakened. In the weeks that followed that freezing November night, Clara stopped fighting for a seat at a table that was never meant for her. She stopped complaining about Evelyn's intrusive presence or trying to catch Julian's fleeting, indifferent gaze. She chose radical responsibility instead. The emotional submissiveness vanished, replaced by the steady, unblinking focus of an auditor mapping a hostile takeover. Every night, after the kids were asleep, and the house grew quiet, Clara retreated to the kitchen island. But she wasn't just doing routine client work anymore. Under the dim light of the pendant lamps, she studied fiercely for her CPA, certified public accountant, license, deep diving into Illinois marital property law, and asset tracing. She also began taking care of herself. She woke up at 5 a.m. for silent, intense workouts in the basement before the household stirred. She drank her water, stood taller, and felt the strength returning to her body. Yet when Julian or Evelyn entered the room, she instantly slipped back into her camouflage, the faded fleece, the submissive posture, the quiet, obedient wife. She let them believe their cold violence had broken her spirit, knowing their arrogance would be their ultimate blind spot. As a financial professional, Clara understood that in suburban America, your identity is bound to your credit score. In December, during a routine credit health audit on Experian, her analytical mind flagged an anomaly. Her pristine FICO score had taken a sudden, violent hit. Drilling down into the raw data, she uncovered the betrayal. 2 high-yield credit lines had been opened using her Social Security number, SSN, without her consent. The statements were sickening. $40,000 in unsecured debt, completely maxed out on luxury hotel stays in downtown Chicago, high-end jewelry boutiques, and lavish dining. Julian wasn't just ignoring her. He was actively funding a secret lifestyle by burying her financial future. Every instinct screamed at her to freeze the accounts and confront him. But Clara forced her breathing to steady. Under federal law, identity theft under a certain threshold could be argued down by expensive lawyers. She needed this to be undeniable. She systematically traced the metadata of the online applications, capturing the exact IP addresses originating from Julian's home office router. She quietly documented every charge, intentionally leaving the accounts active. She was strategically waiting for the balance to climb high enough to trigger the federal threshold for aggravated identity theft, a charge that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. She was letting him dig a hole so deep he could never climb out. The final piece of the puzzle arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning while Clara was clearing the snow from her mailbox. Leo Sterling, the quiet 26-year-old web developer from down the street, approached her. His face was guarded, but his eyes held a genuine protective concern. "Clara," Leo said softly, glancing toward the house to ensure Julian's BMW wasn't in the driveway. "I know things are tense, but you need to know who you're living with. Julian hired me 6 months ago to build a custom credit tracking software for his private ventures. When I delivered it, he completely cut contact and withheld my $8,000 payment. He told me a kid like me didn't have the legal resources to fight a bank officer, but I still have back-end access to the local network traffic." A cold, calculating spark ignited in Clara's chest. She looked at Leo and saw exactly what she needed. An operative. "I don't have the codes to his private servers, Leo," she whispered back, the biting wind whipping her hair. "But I know how to read the ledgers. Help me, and I promise you will get every single dime back before the hammer falls." That very evening, utilizing Leo's tech expertise and Clara's intimate knowledge of Julian's domestic routine, they bypassed the firewalls of Julian's home office computer. What they uncovered inside the encrypted partitions was far more grotesque than a simple affair. Julian had been systematically siphoning over $2 million from the escrow accounts of his elderly mortgage clients, siphoning the liquid cash into a high-risk, shadow margin trading platform to feed a desperate gambling addiction. The market had turned against him, and the deficits were catastrophic. Clara watched the data cascade across the screen, her blood turning to ice as she found the final folder. Julian and Evelyn had already established a shell-holding company. They were actively drafting a plan to fraudulently transfer the sole equity of the house to Evelyn's name, shielding their only clean asset from bank foreclosure before the federal regulators caught wind of the deficit. They were planning to leave Clara destitute, homeless, and saddled with federal debt. Clara closed the laptop. She looked at Leo, her voice eerily calm. "He thinks he's playing chess against a shadow. Let's show him what happens when the shadow owns the board." The winter storm howled like a wounded beast against the double-paned windows of the Naperville house, rattling the thick glass and filling the structure with a low, ominous vibration that vibrated deep within the floorboards. It was 11:30 p.m. Clara sat at the corner of the polished quartz kitchen island, the cold surface sending a chill straight through the sleeves of her worn fleece. The skin on her knuckles felt tight and dry from the biting Illinois wind, and her eyes burned under the dim, clinical hum of a single pendant light overhead. The heavy, stagnant aroma of lukewarm, bitter coffee hung in the air, a familiar companion to the endless rows of tax figures she was pretending to audit on her glowing laptop screen. Suddenly, the front door clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap, letting in a violent blast of sub-zero air that cut through the kitchen and made the pendant light sway on its cord. The sudden drop in temperature was immediate, raising goosebumps on Clara's arms. Julian walked in first, bringing with him the suffocating, artificial warmth of expensive sandalwood cologne, a scent he wore like armor to mask his flaws. Behind him came Miller, a short, stout man clutching a scuffed leather briefcase, his breath still fogging in the sudden warmth of the foyer. Evelyn descended the staircase right on their heels, the heavy rustle of her sweeping silk robe whispering against the wooden steps, her sharp, calculating eyes scanning the room like a hawk tracking prey. "Clara, thank God you're still up," Julian said, his voice rushing with a manic, restless energy that vibrated with hidden desperation. He dropped a thick stack of documents directly over her laptop keyboard, the heavy thud of the paper sending a physical jolt through the quartz counter. "Compliance at the bank is breathing down my neck. We need to file our joint tax returns tonight, or we're going to face a massive federal penalty by tomorrow morning. I brought over Miller. He's a certified notary public, so we can legalize the disclosures right now." Clara looked down at the chaotic, disorganized jumble of papers. It was nearly 70 pages of dense legal jargon, microscopic financial tables, and repetitive tax schedules. The pages smelled faintly of fresh toner, chemical ink, and anxiety. She recognized the tactic instantly. It was a textbook maneuver in corporate asset fraud. Criminals routinely buried a lethal, life-altering clause deep within a mountain of mind-numbing, boring paperwork, relying entirely on the victim's physical exhaustion and blind marital trust to secure a quick, unquestioned signature. "Julian, it's almost midnight," Clara said, keeping her voice mild, slow, and soft. She deliberately projected the image of a tired, submissive housewife whose spirit had been entirely broken by months of his silent treatment. "My eyes are playing tricks on me. Can I read through these in the morning?" "We don't have time, Clara." Julian snapped, his body language tightening instantly as he crossed his arms. He leaned heavily over the counter, his broad frame blocking out the light from the hallway, physically boxing her into her workspace. "It's just standard joint asset declarations. We sign them every single year. Stop making a dramatic production out of this. I'm exhausted. I've had a brutal day at the bank. And I just want to go to bed." "Of course," Clara replied smoothly, lifting her chin to look directly into his frantic eyes, her gaze completely devoid of suspicion. "Show me where you need my name. Let's get it over with." Julian let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as he completely fell for her submissive act. He rapidly flipped through the pages, the crisp, heavy paper rustling loudly in the quiet kitchen. "Sign here," he instructed, his index finger tapping aggressively against a standard tax line. Clara reached into the pocket of her faded fleece and pulled out a sleek, heavy metallic blue ballpoint pen, the specialized forensic tool Leo had helped her procure. To the naked eye, the dark indigo ink flowed beautifully, leaving a sharp, wet, glistening mark on the page. She could smell the faint chemical solvent of the ink as it met the paper. Julian flipped another 20 pages, the sound of tearing edges filling the room. "And here." She signed again, her hand perfectly steady, her pulse slow and rhythmic. Then Julian paused. His breathing hitched slightly, a microscopic tremor catching in his throat as he turned to page 47. He laid his palm flat across the top of the sheet, subtly obscuring the official header as he tapped the signature line at the very bottom. "Just one more right here, honey. Let's get this done so Miller can stamp it and go home." Clara's trained eyes scanned the visible text in a fraction of a second, parsing the sentences with ruthless precision. She didn't need to see the hidden header. She recognized the specific legal boilerplate, the indemnification clauses, and the notched notary stamp box at the bottom. It was an interspousal transfer assessment deed, a legally binding instrument designed to irrevocably strip her of every single right to the property, transferring her 80% inheritance share directly into Evelyn's shell company. They were trying to steal the house paid for by her late father's farm, right in front of her face, while she was sitting in her own kitchen. A wave of cold, crystalline clarity washed over Clara, washing away any residual grief. She smiled warmly at her husband, looking directly into his cold, predatory eyes. "Anything to help your career, Julian." She pressed the tip of the pen firmly into the thick paper, feeling the texture of the grain, and signed Clara Higgins with a beautiful, elaborate flourish. Julian practically snatched the folder from the table before the ink was even dry, his fingers trembling with a genuine, euphoric grin breaking through his exhausted facade. "Thanks, babe. You're a lifesaver. Miller, stamp it." The notary quickly stepped forward, aligned his heavy steel seal, and brought it down. The loud, metallic thump of the notary's stamp echoed through the quiet house like a gavel marking a sentence. Julian sprinted up the stairs toward Evelyn's suite, their muffled laughter echoing down the hallway as they celebrated their flawless victory over the naive, invisible wife. The next morning broke with a heavy, suffocating blanket of gray clouds hanging low over the Chicago skyline, the damp air outside smelling of wet asphalt and impending snow. At 9 a.m. sharp, Evelyn Higgins strode triumphantly into the county recorder's office, clutching the leather folder against her chest like a conquered crown. She approached the high marble counter. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of her heavy designer heels and the metallic rattle of her pearls breaking the sterile quiet of the government office. She slid the document across the counter to the clerk, her voice dripping with smug, maternal satisfaction. "Here you go, dear," Evelyn said, leaning in. "Make sure this deed transfer is registered and processed immediately. It's a high-priority family estate matter." The clerk adjusted her glasses, pulling the folder toward her. She opened the document, flipping past the tax schedules until she reached page 47. She stopped. She blinked, adjusted her glasses again, and turned the page over to inspect the back, looking thoroughly confused. "Ma'am, what exactly am I supposed to be registering here?" "The deed transfer, of course," Evelyn snapped, her voice tightening with instant irritation. "My son and daughter-in-law signed and notarized it last night. The stamp is right there at the bottom." The clerk turned the page around and slid it back across the marble counter under the harsh, buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights. Evelyn leaned down, her eyes widening as she stared at the paper. Page 47 was completely, blindingly blank. The chemical bonds of the specialized forensic ink had reacted precisely as engineered. Exposed to the ambient room temperature and oxygen over the last 24 hours, the indigo ink had completely broken down and evaporated into thin air, leaving no microscopic trace, no indentation, and no legal footprint. The signature was gone. The transfer deed was reduced to a worthless piece of empty paper. The grand inheritance theft had imploded before it even began. Simultaneously, miles away in the heart of downtown Chicago, Clara sat inside a secure, soundproofed law office. The room smelled comfortably of old leather books, polished mahogany, and hot chamomile tea. Her posture was no longer slouched or submissive. She sat perfectly rigid, her shoulders back, her eyes burning with an intense, quiet power that filled the room. She reached into her bag and slid a heavy, metallic USB drive across the table. It made a sharp clink against the glass desktop. "Inside this drive are the complete forensic logs of my husband's identity theft," Clara stated, her voice steady, low, and commanding, devoid of any tremor. "It contains the routing numbers, the IP addresses originating from our home router, and the metadata for the $40,000 in fraudulent credit lines he opened using my Social Security number. He attempted to commit wire fraud to strip me of my core asset." The attorney reviewed the digital files cascading across his monitor, a look of profound, stunned respect washing over his face. He looked up at the woman sitting across from him, realizing he wasn't dealing with a grieving victim, but a master strategist. "This isn't just a standard divorce filing, Clara. This is an absolute trap. You've locked him into a corner he can't buy his way out of. What's your next move?" Clara stood up, smoothing the clean, sharp wrinkles of her tailored coat, her presence expanding to fill the room. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district where Julian worked. The stage was set, the evidence was authenticated, and the countdown had begun. "He thinks he's playing chess against a shadow," Clara said, her eyes narrowing into a razor-sharp gaze as the pale winter sun finally cracked through the clouds, illuminating her face. "He has absolutely no idea that tomorrow night, at his own celebratory bank gala, I am going to turn the lights on, and the entire world will watch his perfect life burn to the ground." The grand dining hall of the Whispering Willows Country Club was an overwhelming sensory assault of Midwestern old money and corporate vanity. Thousands of polished crystal droplets clung to massive chandeliers overhead, refracting the harsh, blinding light into fractured diamond patterns across the vast room. The air was thick, suffocatingly warm, and deeply saturated with the mingling scents of expensive, earthy cigars, roasted prime rib, and the sharp, alcohol-heavy sting of vintage champagne. Everywhere there was noise, the deafening clatter of silver forks scraped against fine porcelain plates, the high-pitched, fake laughter of socialites, and the low, heavy drone of corrupt men discussing interest rates. For Julian, this opulent hall was supposed to be the staging ground for his ultimate professional coronation. Tonight, the bank's regional board of executives would officially announce his long-awaited promotion to branch manager, cementing his place at the apex of the local financial hierarchy. But for Clara, it was the final, agonizing stage of her forced invisibility. Julian had demanded, with a quiet, venomous rage earlier that afternoon, that she arrive 3 full hours before the first guest entered the country club. He had forced her to drive her rusting, rattling 2012 Honda Civic through the muddy service entrance at the back of the property, terrified that the mere sight of her old car might stain the pristine prestige of the valet line where sleek Mercedes and spotless BMWs were beginning to gather. To ensure she would not embarrass him, Julian had personally selected her attire for the evening. He had bought her a cheap, shapeless, scratchy black dress from a clearance outlet, a garment specifically chosen because its dull, light-absorbing fabric ensured she would instantly blend into the background shadows like a member of the waitstaff. The fabric rubbed uncomfortably against her collarbone, a constant, physical reminder of her designated status as a nonentity. "The catering staff is completely short-handed tonight, Clara," Julian whispered sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the private coat room. He stepped in close, using his large frame to pin her against the wall, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and raw arrogance. He adjusted the crisp silk bow tie of his $5,000 custom tuxedo, his eyes flashing with a cold, patronizing dominance that felt like a physical blow. "Since you possess absolutely no real corporate value to offer my managing partners, the very least you can do is make yourself useful behind the scenes. Go to the kitchen. Supervise the hors d'oeuvres line. Direct the waitstaff. Make sure the guest bathrooms stay perfectly stocked and clean. I don't need you lingering around the senior executives looking like a pathetic charity case. Don't speak to anyone, and stay out of the light." Evelyn stood right beside him, a vision of wealthy decay draped in a heavy, blood-red designer gown. The metallic clink of her pearls echoed against the wooden coat racks as she raised a crystal flute of champagne to her painted lips. She let out a dry, rattling scoff, her eyes narrowing as she looked down her nose at Clara. "Do try to look subdued and obedient, dear," Evelyn sneered, waving a manicured hand dismissively, the sharp scent of her heavy floral perfume choking the small space. "We are introducing this bank's future leadership tonight. It helps immensely if you don't confuse the senior partners about who actually runs our household and holds the assets. Go on, shoo. The kitchen staff is waiting." Clara did not flinch. Her skin remained cool, her breathing rhythmic and undisturbed. She simply nodded, smoothing down the rough, cheap fabric of the black dress, and walked out into the grand ballroom. She carried herself like a literal ghost, navigating the perimeter of the room with absolute silence. For the next 2 hours, she worked tirelessly in the shadows, her hands catching empty champagne flutes, her fingers picking up stained cocktail napkins, and her voice quietly directing the young waiters with trays of caviar. She played the part of the broken, completely humiliated housewife so perfectly, so submissively, that Julian completely stopped tracking her movements. He looked right through her as she passed his table, his mind entirely consumed by his own impending glory. He had absolutely no idea that her submissive posture was not a sign of defeat, but the ultimate flawless camouflage. By 9 p.m., the atmosphere inside the grand hall had reached a fever pitch of drunken celebration and corporate self-congratulation. The air felt heavier now, sticky with sweat and the humidity of hundreds of breathing bodies. Julian stood court near the center of the room, right beneath the massive stage, surrounded by a tight circle of the bank's wealthy regional directors. His chest was puffed out, his face flushed red from expensive scotch, his loud, boisterous voice echoing across the tables as he lectured a group of nodding investors on the virtues of aggressive risk diversification and the absolute necessity of eliminating deadweight liabilities from the ledger. Finally, a sharp, metallic chime rang through the room as the managing partner clinked a silver spoon against the rim of his crystal glass. The crowd slowly fell into an expectant, glittering silence, the heavy jazz band tapering off into a quiet murmur. The managing partner strode up the wooden steps of the main stage, adjusting the microphone with a loud, static hum. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude tonight's spectacular regional celebrations, I want to welcome our prospective new branch manager to the stage to outline his brilliant vision for our premier escrow portfolios, the managing partner announced, his voice booming through the integrated surround sound speakers. Julian Higgins, please step up. The room erupted into a wave of polite, roaring applause, the sound of hundreds of palms clapping together echoing off the vaulted ceilings like thunder. Julian strode up the stairs, his leather-soled shoes clicking loudly against the hardwood stage. He radiated an almost intoxicating aura of smug, untouchable triumph. He took the microphone, looking down at the sea of wealthy faces with absolute superiority. As his eyes scanned the back of the room, he caught sight of Clara standing quietly near the service exit, her black dress melting into the dark wallpaper. A cruel, predatory sneer curled his lips. He reached his hand into the silk-lined breast pocket of his tuxedo, his fingers brushing against the crisp edges of the manila envelope containing the finalized divorce papers and the 30-day eviction notice he fully intended to drop into her lap the very moment the gala concluded. "Thank you, everyone," Julian began, his deep voice projecting effortlessly across the vast, silent space. Building lasting institutional wealth is entirely about recognizing when a fundamental, ruthless restructuring is absolutely necessary to preserve the core asset. Sometimes the greatest liabilities we face are not in the volatile global markets, but inside our own homes, hidden in the shadows. Before the final insulting word could leave his mouth, the cheerful, background jazz music playing through the country club's integrated audio system cut off with a sharp, ear-splitting whine of audio feedback. The piercing screech made the guests wince, several directors lowering their glasses in confusion. Julian froze, his charming, practiced smile faltering on his face as the microphone in his hand went dead. High above the marble fireplace, the massive 85-inch digital display screen, which had been quietly looping a brightly colored slideshow of the bank's corporate logos and charity achievements, flickered violently, the colors bleeding away into a stark, pitch-black void. Stationed safely inside the tech booth at the back of the hall, his fingers flying across a glowing mechanical keyboard, Leo Sterling tapped the final, definitive keystroke on his laptop. With that single stroke, he completely overrode the country club's private network firewall, deploying the encrypted payload Clara had delivered to him. A second later, the massive screen flashed back to life, illuminating the dark ballroom with a harsh, high-definition white glare. It wasn't a corporate logo. It was clear, infrared home surveillance footage. The timestamp in the corner glowed bright white, 2 a.m. the previous night. The location displayed in crisp text was unmistakable, Clara's private home office. The entire room of Chicago's financial elite watched in stunned, breathless silence as the black and white versions of Julian and Evelyn crept into the video frame on screen. The audio system crackled back to life, but it didn't play music. Instead, It broadcasted their urgent, venomous whispers at maximum volume, the sound filling every corner of the vast hall with pristine clarity. "Hurry up and grab the inheritance documents from the desk drawer," Evelyn's digital voice hissed through the ballroom speakers, her recorded tone echoing off the walls with terrifying sharpness. "We need the exact policy numbers from her father's farm before we force her to sign the property surrender deed tomorrow night." On screen, the guests watched Julian's face illuminate under the harsh flash of his phone camera as he rapidly photographed Clara's private legal papers. "I have them," Julian's recorded voice whispered back, a cold chuckle vibrating through the country club's premium speakers. "By the time I hand her the divorce papers next month, the house will belong entirely to your shell company. She's so submissive, she'll walk out of the courtroom with absolutely nothing." A collective, audible wave of absolute horror swept through the grand dining hall. The fake laughter was entirely gone, replaced by sharp gasps and the frantic whispers of hundreds of people. Women covered their mouths with manicured hands, staring up at the screen in shock. The managing partner's face hardened instantly into a mask of pure professional disgust, his eyes locked on the cinema-quality display as he watched his star employee openly commit a blatant, calculated felony. On stage, Julian completely snapped. The polished crystal champagne glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor with a sharp, musical crash that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Splinters of glass and expensive alcohol sprayed across his polished shoes. He lunged wildly toward the media console at the side of the stage, his face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly panic as he frantically screamed at the invisible tech staff to cut the power cords. "Turn it off. Cut the feed. This is a fabrication." Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into pure, high-pitched hysteria, his tailored $5,000 tuxedo suddenly looking like a pathetic, oversized costume. But the video loop was heavily encrypted, buried deep within the system's root directory. The surveillance footage suddenly vanished, replaced not by blackness, but by a massive, high-contrast forensic spreadsheet. The bright rows of data detailed the exact account numbers of Julian's shadow margin trading platform, the electronic routing numbers to hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the explicit names of the 5 elderly mortgage clients he had systematically defrauded of over $2 million to feed his gambling addiction. "I said turn it off," Julian roared, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. But it was already too late. From the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, 2 plainclothes investigators from the bank's Federal Internal Fraud Division stepped forward, their faces expressionless, their eyes locked on the stage. They were flanked by 2 uniformed local police officers, the metallic jangle of their utility belts and handcuffs cutting through the tense silence of the room. They did not use brute force. They did not shout or draw weapons. They moved with the terrifying, icy precision of the law. They walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, bypassing the panicked, fleeing socialites who scrambled out of their way. The lead investigator stepped directly onto the stage, pulling a folded federal arrest warrant from the breast pocket of his coat. He intercepted Julian just as the disgraced officer attempted to flee toward the backstage exit. "Julian Higgins, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft," the investigator announced, his calm voice echoing clearly over the microphone Julian had dropped on the podium. Julian stood completely paralyzed, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. His arrogant corporate bravado instantly evaporated, leaving behind the hollow, shivering terror of a cornered child. The 2 police officers spun him around roughly, pushing him chest first against a massive marble column at the edge of the stage. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with 2 sharp, definitive clicks that signaled the absolute end of his life as a free man. Across the room, near the VIP tables, Evelyn began screaming hysterically, her voice a ragged, desperate shriek as she clutched her pearls so hard the strings snapped, sending the white spheres scattering and bouncing across the hardwood floor like tiny drops of ice. A female police officer stepped directly into her path, her voice low and firm, as she began reading Evelyn her Miranda rights for conspiracy to commit grand theft. The high society gala had transformed into a spectacular public execution of their names, their freedom, and their carefully manufactured legacy. Clara stood perfectly still in the dark shadows by the service exit, her posture rigid, her chin lifted high. Bathed in the dim light of the exit sign, she watched the monsters who had tried to reduce her to a shadow being led away through the crowd in heavy metal chains. Her face was a mask of pure, unshakable calm. The storm had passed, and the audit was finally complete. The aftermath of the country club bust moved with the cold, mechanical precision of the federal justice system. Once a white-collar empire built on deception is breached, the walls collapse overnight. For the next 6 months, Clara spent her mornings assisting the bank's internal auditors and the federal prosecutors, providing the meticulously indexed forensic files and encrypted routing hashes she and Leo had gathered. True to her word, Clara's first legal maneuver before the federal asset freeze took effect was filing an emergency prejudgment civil lien on behalf of Leo Sterling. Because she had successfully uncovered Julian's hidden personal asset log, the court legally recognized Leo as a secured creditor. His stolen $8,000 fee, plus damages, was securely clawed back from Julian's luxury watch collection and sports car equity before the federal government absorbed the remaining accounts for restitution. The hammer of justice fell heavily on the architects of the fraud. Julian stood before a federal judge in a stark orange jumpsuit, his confident swagger entirely erased, replaced by the hollow stare of a broken man. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft, followed by a permanent, lifetime ban from the financial industry. Evelyn faced her own catastrophic downfall. Deemed a core co-conspirator in the attempted property theft, her personal assets were systematically liquidated by the IRS to pay back the defrauded elderly clients. Stripped of her country club memberships, her luxury savings, and the high society image she had spent decades cultivating, Evelyn was forced to move into a tiny, subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, living out her days in the exact destitution she had so gleefully planned for Clara. 6 months after the flashing blue and red lights illuminated the country club driveway, peace finally returned to the Naperville home. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to constrict Clara's chest every time she heard Julian's footsteps had vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet, profound stillness. It was late May, and the suburban sky was painted in the warm, breathtaking hues of the golden hour. Clara stood in the newly renovated sunroom at the back of the house, watching the amber sunlight pour through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The estate was no longer a domestic prison or a fortress hiding marital criminals. It was a sanctuary. Through a relentless pursuit of the law and financial tracing, the home was now legally, indisputably, and entirely hers. Inside the sunroom, positioned in the absolute center of the radiant light, sat her mother's vintage Singer sewing machine. Clara walked over and rested her hand on the polished black iron. Leo had spent 3 weeks helping her restore it, stripping away the rust and oiling the gears until the heavy machine gleamed as perfectly as it had in her childhood memories on the Kansas farm. It was no longer an abandoned piece of junk in a dumpster. It was a monument to her resilience. Clara looked out at the horizon, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips. Her mind drifted briefly to Julian and Evelyn, but to her surprise, she felt no anger, no bitter resentment, and no lingering hatred. Her radical shift in mindset had liberated her from the role of the victim. They were no longer characters who defined her pain. They were simply a balanced line in an old ledger, a set of toxic liabilities that had been permanently audited and neutralized. She had stopped weeping for the shadow she used to be. By choosing education, financial independence, and decisive action, she had written her own future and secured her children's safety. Clara took a deep, clear breath of the warm spring air. She stood tall, bathed in the golden light, independent, proud, and beautifully, irrevocably free. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.